Radical Secular, a video series dedicated to the separation of church and state and the pursuit of justice.
Hello, and welcome back to the Radical Secular. I'm Sean Prophet.
I'm Christophe Difo.
Today on our news segment, we will have the latest on the Trump campaign's crash and burn strategy for the home stretch of his campaign, the collapse of Attorney General Bill Barr's fake investigation of President Obama. We'll talk about the Supreme Court confirmation hearings for Judge Barrett, Mitt Romney, Keith Olbermann, fake ballot boxes in California, and Republican rats like Senator Ben Sasse jumping off the sinking Trump ship. We'll have all that for you and more. And our second segment today is our guest segment. We have a special guest. His name is Joe Szimhart. He's here to talk to us about the connection between cults and spirituality, the right-wing authoritarian movements, with an emphasis on Church Universal and Triumphant. For those of you who don't know, Church Universal and Triumphant is the cult that both Christophe and I grew up in. And it was started by my parents, Mark and Elizabeth Prophet. That's their real name. Today, the vast majority of the members of that church have become Trump supporters. No surprise. Mr. Szimhart is an expert on the history and traditions of the occult. Basically, all non-traditional religions is what he covers, and traditional religion. He has a YouTube series called Cults in the Occulture, which I found incredibly interesting. So after our guest segment, our third topic will be cleaning up the mess, what a post-Trump America might look like if Joe Biden wins the election, which it looks like he's going to. So
fingers crossed.
And we will be going off the radical radar, which is a brief summary of what Christophe and I have been up to this week. Before we get into that, though, I want to first remind you to make sure and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to hit that red subscribe button and be sure to give us a 5-star rating on your podcast channel. Tell your friends and family about our show. Word of mouth really matters. Second, I want to plug the Just Words Fallacy Medium publication. Just Words Fallacy posts weekly articles from progressive, diverse authors related to politics, religion, rationality, and justice. Link is in the show notes. If you're interested in publishing your work on the Just Words Fallacy publication, here is our contact info.
Email us at theradicalsecular@gmail.com. Follow us on Instagram @radical_secular. Follow us on Twitter @radicalsecular. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, podcasts at Apple, Google, Spotify, and Stitcher.
Okay, let's get into the t-shirts. Christophe, what are you wearing today?
All right. So today I'm wearing so back before the pandemic began, and we used to be able to go to bars, Lindsay and I would frequent, and a lot of my friends and buddies would frequent a place called the Pet Shop, and it's a bar in Jersey City. And I'm wearing this shirt for a couple of reasons. I'll just let you describe it for me, Sean.
Okay. It says Pet Shop, and it has a skull. It looks like the skull is in a cage of some sort. And let's see if there's anything else there. I think that's it.
And that's the gist of it. So what it is, though, is that it is my favorite bar in Jersey City. Again, I've been there once to actually buy this T-shirt since the pandemic. But the point is that it has a sort of cage skull, which is very Misfits, which is a band, a hard, like sort of punk band. And so I'm wearing it today because it would be, just we're talking to Joe later, and this would just fly in the face of all of the cut theology and all of the cut ideas. And secondly, as we're going to this election, I'm reminded of how happy I am to live in this city, Jersey City. I really do love living here. And I went and dropped off my ballot today, a couple days ago. And just the feeling of doing that in this city again, 4 years later, was really exciting. So that's why I'm rocking the shirt today. So what about you, Sean?
Well, I am wearing Baphomet.
Very nice. Very nice. Beautiful, beautiful image. I love it. I love it. I love the it's basically just Satan, right? The Satan look. I love it.
Well, this is a very interesting image because, I always like to talk about, gods and devils are really two sides of the same coin. And so we don't really particularly put much stock in gods here at the Radical Secular, nor do we put stock in devils. So to me, this is just another, it's like, are we talking about Obi-Wan Kenobi or Luke or Darth Vader? It's like, these are just characters in a movie, characters in in our psychology, more importantly than that. And I really like this Baphomet because, Baphomet has a beard and boobs.
I love that. I love it.
I mean, and this just really gets under the skin of religious type people who have really like repressed their sexuality and who are really pissed off about sex in general. And so, the idea of Baphomet is it just gets under their skin. And I'm happy to do that because, I'm trying to move them to consider how ridiculous their religion is. I mean, this is not because I don't believe in the devil. I mean, come on, who are we kidding here?
Right. Of course not.
So, okay.
It's absurd.
All right. Let's get into the news then. Up first, President Trump says he might leave the country if he loses the election.
Yeah. I think that's just fantastic. And right, I mean, he has been setting this up, right? Like he sees the writing on the wall. And look, we're not in the prediction business here. We're not, right? I mean, things look great at the end of in 2016. It didn't work out well. So who knows what happens? But Trump does see the writing on the wall. He sees the polls. He has better polling than we ever see, right? And so he knows what's happening here. And so he's trying to set it up. Right. If Biden wins, then it's a hoax. It's whatever. And maybe I'll leave the country.
Oh yeah, and he's been increasingly sort of coming to terms with this. First of all, saying there's not going to be a peaceful transition of power because I'm going to win. And then now he finally said on his town hall that he would. And before that, he was begging suburban women to please like him. As far as I'm concerned, man, this is Trump going like this. Right? That's the Trump campaign right now. Right.
That's fucking perfect, man. You're absolutely right.
So, I mean, he was there debating. He can't stand being held to account by women, right? Whether it was Hillary Clinton or this Savannah Guthrie, who was the moderator, right, at his town hall. And I mean, she interrupted him practically as many times as he interrupted Joe Biden. It was hilarious.
It's so true. She was the best moderator I've seen in all of these debates so far. In fact, she might be one of the best moderators I've ever seen in terms of holding not just him to account. Like, I mean, it's really great that she must have really studied the last debate, right? And saw exactly what she needed to say. How does she need to say it? She's also an attorney, right? And so she is apparently really good at cross-examination because she essentially cross-examined him in real time, fact checking him. It was outstanding what she did. And we talk about Stephanopoulos later on, but.
Yeah, well, that's journalism. What Savannah Guthrie did is journalism. We fucking need more of that,
So true.
But, Biden, of course, talked to voters for 90 minutes, and shocker, actually just answered their questions and with mostly factual answers. I mean, Stephanopoulos, I don't know, man. He seemed like he was there to prove that he wasn't a shill for Democrats. That's
yeah, it's so true. That's a really good point. It's like he was just there to sort of make sure that that he could walk away and not be criticized after the fact. Like that's what it sounded like he was there to do. I think you brought it up. Earlier where you were talking about how he was just right. He was just there to sort of not grill Biden, but sort of point out flaws in what Biden said. And Biden, for his part, was, I think, I walked away from that feeling. He's always come across as very presidential throughout this entire race. He's been like the president, right? The shadow president in some way. But he really came across this time. He really shines in this environment, right? And he was just connecting with the voters. The way he talked about, he mentioned to the black dude, he's like, "You want to talk afterward, right?"
Mm-hmm. And then he did.
And then he did. And then he in fact did, because that's the kind of guy he is. I listened to Pod Save America this week, and they had Obama on. And Obama talked about this exact thing of how Biden is. And it was I had these back-to-back experiences of being like, oh my God. I listened to Biden for an hour and a half or whatever. I listened to Obama for an hour, and I'm like, wow, right. This is what it sounds like when people are just at a minimum competent, just at a minimum.
We've gotten so just, I guess, inured or immune or just numb to, Trump's craziness. And this is what we need in a president. And how people can criticize him, I don't know. But, we had a lot of that this week. They're trying to go for the kill right now. And Rudy Giuliani and Steve Bannon, remember him, attempted to drum up another scandal about Hunter Biden, which is the thing that we've been talking about that they were pushing. That's what Trump was impeached for for fuck's sake.
I know, exactly right. And you know what? This is really interesting because what they want, because at this point in the race in 2016, they were in a similar position, not as bad as they were now, but they needed a break, right? And they got it with the email scandal like days before the election, right? Comey and everything else. So so they're looking for that again, because that is what turned the tide for them. That was enough to push them over the edge.
Well, that's when people trusted the FBI. Now, it's like nobody's going to trust anything the Trump government says, which is
that's a great point.
If you're not already a supporter. And so this whole thing just fizzled out like a wet firecracker. And as a matter of fact, first the story broke in the New York Post, and then social media downranked the story, and then Kayleigh McEnany, the White House press secretary, that theocrat, she got her Twitter account frozen for trying to share the story. So talk about the Keystone Cops, man. These guys are just
cops. Yeah, totally. Yeah, exactly. It's almost like slapstick, it's so comical,
That's why I brought the slide whistle, because, it's so ridiculous. It's just, now the FBI is saying that Giuliani had been duped by a Russian intelligence agent about the story and is now investigating him. So it's just like, things look good. Things look good. And I hope they stay that way.
Yeah.
Because Republicans are jumping like, rats off a sinking ship. I mean, Senator Ben Sasse just recently accused Trump of coddling dictators, which all the Republicans know this. They just haven't been willing to say it. And, Trump fires back and says he was stupid and obnoxious and the least effective of our 53 Republican senators. But the only way Trump thinks anyone's effective is when they kiss his ass. So, it's like everybody, I think people are just sick of it.
I think so too, Sean. I think so too. I think the jig is up, right? And again, I'm not taking a position on whether or not Biden wins, because I just don't, and I'm not superstitious. I'm really not. But nevertheless, maybe I just don't want to have egg on my face after the fact. But we are seeing the rats running off the ship. As I like to point out, this is like an animal in the corner, being poked by a rake, a rabid animal. Like, we are watching this. We are watching the machinations, right? The appeal to the white suburban women by just saying, like, I'm going to protect your damn house, and you don't like how I talk, but here I hear. But and not even trying to make a real pitch to voters, but just begging for their votes. I mean, begging for their votes, like from the lectern, and doing these sort of rallies every day just to stoke his ego and get out the vote. But this is what happens when you don't make any attempt to consolidate a coalition,
or to govern,
or have a plan for the. He doesn't have any plan.
His plan is, because unlike any other election, there's going to be an election, and then there's going to be a post-election battle. I mean, this happened a little bit with Bush v. Gore, but that was small. That was one state, and it was like close. So he knows this needs to be close, because if it's not close, it's over. And I guarantee you, even if it's not close, he's still going to try to pull something.
Definitely. I mean, we know now who Donald Trump is. And Obama said yesterday that running for president reveals who you are, and becoming president or shows your weaknesses, and reveals your weaknesses, and becoming president puts them on full display. And we all knew he was a shitty guy before, but now we know he's not only shitty, he's incompetent, he's a narcissist, he's a sociopath. We now know all of these facts about him, and now it's not just we progressives that know this. The entire country knows this. The only question now is whether people who are really racist and people who are really into white supremacy, whether they're willing to say, okay, even in the face of economic disaster, even in the face of a pandemic, even in the face of all these things, my position in the hierarchy, this man is going to defend it, and I'm still willing to do this. So this is going to be hardcore Christians, outright racists, and soft racists, right? That's all who's left. That's all who's left.
Right. Yeah. And so, and we see, the Republican Party is abandoning him, and they have to hedge their bets a little, because if he wins somehow, they're worried. But, like John Kelly he has no fucks to give. And he said about Trump this week, the depths of his dishonesty is just astounding to me. The dishonesty, the transactional nature of every relationship, though, It's more pathetic than anything else. He is the most flawed person I've ever met in my life. Now,
oh man, I love that. I mean, that's ever met in my entire life, and right. Yeah. And this is, I think, what most people who have met the man and have worked with him, at least, I think, probably walk away feeling, unless they are like sycophants,
Yeah, well, and of course, anytime Trump, has someone say anything like that about him, he immediately goes after that person's character. But with John Kelly, he said, like, he hired the guy. How are you going to criticize the guy that you hired as being a, no good or inconsequential or any of that kind of stuff that he normally does? He says, oh, he was always a loser. Well, you hired him. Why did you hire him?
So why did you hire a loser then? That really calls into question your thought process a little bit, right? I mean, how do you hire people? We know how he hires people, but I see your point,
He doesn't think things through, so, and Bill Barr's investigation just, he's a rat still on the ship. And, he recently concluded that his fake investigation into President Obama and Joe Biden with no finding of wrongdoing. And he had people in the Justice Department quit. We talked about this a couple weeks ago about some very high level prosecutors in the Justice Department that have quit over this thing. And, it wasn't enough for him and Trump to suppress the findings of the Mueller report, which was very damning to him. He had to try to go and turn it around that it was actually President Obama who committed the real crime and President Obama who should be arrested. But, it all fell apart. There was no wrongdoing. And since President Obama was doing his job.
And what's happened here is what happens to anyone who builds, and Joe Occhipinti said this in his piece that he wrote for Just Words Fallacy, is that when an ideology that is based on hierarchy and dogma runs into reality, it's inevitable that it runs into reality. Reality exists. No matter how you try to pretend like it doesn't, it really actually does exist. And there really is objective truth. And so you can believe whatever you want to believe, but eventually it's going to run into reality. And luckily we have an electoral system that means that there's some level of accountability. Of course, it's eroded significantly.
One last chance at this point, because if he has a chance to, imagine another 300 or 500 federal judges.
Oh my God!
Imagine, all the stuff he could do with the bureaucracy already. He's politicized the bureaucracy substantially, but imagine, by the end of a second Trump term, it would be completely politicized. There would be no experts left, nobody who could get us out of the fog of nonsense.
That's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
So, and speaking of which, I know I was going to talk about why I called Barrett Amy Covid Serena Joy Barrett.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, look, okay, first of all, we know that she is like the handmaid because she was in the group that the Handmaid's Tale was based on. And so, Serena Joy actually was somebody who was probably smarter than her. So I don't even know if she deserves that. Because as a justice, she's just as a judge, she showed her complete ignorance, during those hearings. And her first thing that she did was to bring her children to that White House Rose Garden ceremony where nobody was wearing masks.
Unbelievable. She
would endanger her own children. So what's she going to do for, when she has to rule on things that have to do with America's children? And here's a list of all the things that just a partial list of some of things she didn't know or wouldn't answer. She wouldn't discuss how she would rule on some of the most consequential issues of our time, like Roe v. Wade, climate change, or voting rights. She would not commit to recusing herself in any case related to the 2020 election. She couldn't name the 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, specifically forgetting the right of citizens to petition for the redress of grievances, which is what the judicial system is literally based on. I know you have something to say about that, Christophe.
Yeah. I mean, so, boy. Yeah, right. So as a jurist, right, she is, I think that a lot of the folks up there gave her a pass. The judges the senators gave her sort of a pass. So at the end, Feinstein went out and said, oh, look, this was the most amazingly run process. I'm so glad, Mr. Chairman, that we did this for the American people. And then she went and hugged Lindsey Graham afterward, which is, first of all, a violation of social justice, of social distancing norms, but also like Lindsey fucking Graham. Are you kidding me? I mean, she, I think Feinstein needs to go. But the point is that there's people that gave her a pass. And this woman, she made a mockery, frankly, of not only the process, but of, I think, lawyers, of attorneys, right? She is a mockery of attorneys, because attorneys is a commitment to the law. She hides behind originalism and Scalia and all that, but that's fucking bullshit. She is an activist judge. She is absolutely an activist judge. This is who she is. And so this sort of, we get this from the right all the time, right? She wasn't even able to answer, right? It's literally in the Constitution that the transition of power is in the Constitution. And she refused to say whether to commit. She could commit to that. This is she said she's an originalist, but she can't even say, oh yeah, you know what? I can concede that, yeah, the Constitution says, literally in words, that talks about it's not, that's not implied. There's no, right? And so this woman is a joke. She's a shill. This entire time, Sean, this entire week, I listen to the news every day. I read the news every day, just like you do, just like our listeners do, our smart listeners do. And I was depressed. Even though I see the polls and things are looking great, I know there is nothing we can do to stop her from getting on the court. And there's nothing. So Mitch McConnell has spent the last 3 years pumping the courts full of people just like her. And he finally got one on the Supreme Court. This makes Kavanaugh and all of them look like nothing. She is exactly why we do this show. She is exactly it, Sean.
Yeah. I mean, and so many things. Okay. First of all, she's not even an originalist because she doesn't know her Constitution. But even if she were, the original Constitution without amendments is a document for feudalism. It does not, it disenfranchises Black people, women. It favors property over human rights. It is the Electoral College and the Senate are undemocratic. The original Constitution, I'm going to say it, and I don't care who doesn't like it, it's not worth being used as toilet paper, honestly.
Yeah. So as an attorney, my fealty is to that. It's that document, right? And not that I'm offended by you calling it toilet paper at all. I'm just not like that. I mean, I just, fuck holy cows, man. I'm not, fuck that. I will say though that it is. And this is right. This is why the originalist argument originalist argument is always just a smokescreen for I want to hold back progress. Like that's all it's all it ever was. That's all it ever is. And now, by the way, and we talked about this last week, how finally the veneer of civility and the curtain has been pulled back. The emperor has no clothes. They're not even dog foghorns. We're not even pretending to be originalists. We're not even pretending to care about process in the Senate. It is a naked power grab, and they're not even pretending anymore.
Right. Well, and I also want to qualify what I said about the Constitution. I think that if you take the Constitution and then you add the amendments, okay, and then you add the entire body of case law that has been developed over the last 200 years to help interpret the Constitution, and you give, you have a Supreme Court like the Warren Court or a Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg on it and a liberal majority, then you have something that we can work with. But when you corrupt the process, okay, by taking it and saying, okay, first of all, we're going to throw out a lot of these established cases that have granted people human rights. We're going to even possibly go back and throw out some of these amendments, to the Constitution. Although they can't really get rid of the amendments, they can change how they're interpreted to make them meaningless. As they've done, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment were really not fully applied until this century. And they were passed, I guess they were applied when the Civil Rights Act came in the 20th century.
That's when it really like became, as a practical matter, enforced, right?
Right.
Yeah. And I think you're absolutely right about that, right? And the idea of stare decisis, right, is sort of the bedrock of how, and precedent is a bedrock of how our judicial system works, how judges deal with cases and case law, and they're bound by the cases that they passed before. And so the idea that you can just at any time, and she refused, by the way, to fully commit to that concept as well. So the idea that you could at any time just throw out those rulings it just demonstrates that we are talking about the most activist of activist judges, right? The person who thinks that, like, because these old cases that they think were wrongly decided, including, by the way, the anti-miscegenation stuff. We have gay marriage, all these things that she thinks are bad, and she thinks that it doesn't matter, that it's okay, that she can just vote against this stuff.
Here's the point. At some point, she's going to have to choose.
And the Affordable Care Act, for fuck's sake, the Affordable Care Act.
And the Affordable Care Act. I mean, it's horrific to contemplate, which is why, she really is the handmaid's justice on the Supreme Court. And she's going to have to choose at some point between her overriding Christian faith, which she's imbibed her entire life. I mean, you just look at her life. Okay, she has 7 children. She considers herself to be owned by her husband. I mean, it beggars belief that she would get all the way through the gauntlet of a lifetime like that, living in a group like that, clerking for Scalia, supporting originalism, and then suddenly now she's going to rule fairly on cases. It's impossible.
It's a fucking joke. It's a fucking joke, man. And you brought it up, earlier too, right? This idea, like and I don't know if it was you or somebody else who was talking about when she talked, her describing her children, right?
Oh yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay. So this was
go for it. This is
reported.
Huge.
Yeah, it's huge. Okay. So when she talked about her biological children who are white, she focused on their intellectual achievements. But when she was describing her Black adopted children, she focused on their temperament and them being athletes. So it's very clear.
Fucking real.
Fucking
real. And this is the woman who said, "Oh, I can't possibly be racist. I have Black children."
Yeah. Well, and this is what they do also. This is that her idea of social justice is, I adopted Black children. Well, that doesn't help anybody else. That's you in your wealthy, connected family, right? Doing this one good thing. Well, what about all of the poor kids who you're not adopting? And so she'll go ahead and she'll rule against, various programs that will help other people while being all self-righteous and saying, well, I do this for my children. And
I can't even imagine what those poor kids are learning. I as a person of color who grew up in a white environment, like, and around people who didn't take social justice seriously, who didn't understand the Black experience, and this woman is raising those children. My heart hurts for those children, because they are going to go through a lifetime of either A, being like Candace Owens, or B, having to find a way to come to terms with this.
Yeah, and that's the journey that we've, you and I have been through it as well, both of us, because we had to get out of this highly religious environment, and
exactly.
I mean, these kids, they've got a tough road, and my heart goes out to them. Well, I had a bunch of other stuff we were going to talk about in the news, but I'll just touch on it briefly. Mitt Romney is tone policing and telling us we need all this civility. He went after Keith Olbermann, who, by the way, if you haven't watched it, Keith Olbermann is back with his daily worst person in the world segment. It is awesome. I missed him, and it's good to have him back. But he definitely ruffled some feathers, including Mitt Romney. So,
Mitt Romney can go fuck himself, honestly. I mean, I've had it up to here with his faux civility, but when it really comes down to it, he was going to vote. He's going to toe the party line, just because he thinks he's going to one day be the savior of the Republican Party down the road. If he actually showed some mettle and stood up for things and stood up for what was right, that would be a different question. But at the end of the day, he won't. He won't.
I mean, here's the thing, and you've got him as supposedly the moderate Republican, the good Republican. He could save America from this justice, who will, without question, take away human rights from millions of people in this country, and probably worse, climate rulings. Who knows? But he could save America from that, but he won't. He won't.
Nope.
So
he sure won't.
He can go fuck himself. We both agree.
He wants his regulations. He wants his deregulations. He'd be perfectly happy with there being no abortion, and he wants his pro-business. And so, this is the deal that all those sort of Republicans have made, right? They've all made this sort of deal with the devil. They're like, right, we'll deal with these batshit right-wingers because we're going to get our deregulation, right? And we're going to get our deregulation. That's all we want. We want deregulation.
And the last good Republican, I think, was John McCain, because he actually saved he saved the Affordable Care Act. But not Susan Collins, not Mitt Romney, not any of these guys, so anyway, something like 25 million people have already voted, many of them braving long lines in GOP states. Apparently it's looking like it's a big Democratic surge, since we haven't seen too many red hats in those lines. It seems like everything is pointing to a Biden win, but we cannot relax until everyone votes and all the votes are counted. So please, we'll be hitting this hard next week as well. Get out there. Phone bank, write letters, contribute. This is the home stretch, folks, and good luck to us all.
Oh yeah, man. Oh man, the anxiety,
Yeah, it's been tough. All right, well, let's introduce our guest. Joe Szimhart is an artist, a cult information specialist, and a mental health professional who currently works for a psychiatric emergency hospital in Pennsylvania. He made his living as a cult interventionist from 1985 through 1998 after exploring and rejecting groups and teachings derivative of Theosophy and New Thought, including Agni Yoga and the Summit Lighthouse, also known as Church Universal and Triumphant. Earlier this year, he published Santa Fe, Bill, Tate, and Me, How an Artist Became a Cult Intervention Specialist. He is often sought by the media for his opinions and expertise about cult phenomena. So without further delay, we bring you Joe Szimhart. Joe, welcome to our program. Thank you for being here.
Sure. Appreciate you inviting me. This is a wonderful opportunity for a conversation with my past almost, and what's going on today about all of this cult stuff, including the group that you and I were most interested in at one time.
Yeah, and I'm really glad that we could make this happen, and that you were willing to do it. Before we get started, do you have any kind of a T-shirt or a painting or anything you'd like to talk about?
Well, sure. I put this shirt on here. I don't know if you guys can see it. I'll stand up a little bit. It's from Santa Fe, New Mexico, and that's the city where a lot of my questing began, and how I got involved in the I Am activity, the Agni Yoga Society, and the Church Universal and Triumphant back in 1975. And my backstory is that all that came together all in one day. The first day I got there, the seeds for that exploration began. And it happened in an art gallery. I was in a friend's art gallery, Bill Tate. I met him that day, and he represented my work there until he died in 1987. But we got to be friends. So Santa Fe has a deep significance for me in my life. In fact, the memoir I wrote begins Santa Fe, Bill Tate, and Me, that I published this year. So it's that whole event is described in there, how this journey started of an artist becoming a cult specialist or an intervention specialist.
Yeah, well, I want to start out first by acknowledging that Joe and I are not entirely strangers, and although this is the first time we've actually spoken in person, we have a history, and it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, because both Christophe and I grew up in the cult my parents started, which was the Church Universal and Triumphant, otherwise known as the Summit Lighthouse, or more commonly to ex-members, CUT. In the years since I've been out, I've often joked that CUT is cult without the L, and they don't like that word. They don't like the word cult at all, and
they do not like it.
It really get upset.
Well, they don't even like short names like Joe. They want to call you Joseph.
Right.
So CUT was considered some kind of an evil rendition of Church Universal and Triumphant.
Yeah. And, we've both been out of that cult for a long time. And I still remember, you were sort of seen as the bête noire in the cult. You were, of course, as you just mentioned, an exit counselor or deprogrammer. And, your name was featured prominently in our decree sessions and the fact sheets on our enemies list. Which they
that's
always...
remarkable. I didn't realize that all those, because I remember the invocations that we used to do, right?
Yeah.
Right. where, and I was really young, but still we had to learn this sort of stuff, right? And I remember those long invocations that my parents would say on Saturday mornings with their chopping sword. And so it's funny to think that your name, Joe, could have been in part of that. That's really interesting.
Yeah,
It's
it is.
true.
It's the use of the what they call the science of the spoken word, which is decrees. They call them decrees. And the idea was that when you speak out an idea, it actually has vibrational power that can affect reality. It's called sympathetic magic. In other words, if I say something about somebody, it's going to affect them wherever they are on the world.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like voodoo. It's just, voodoo being a physical representation of that. Well, you want to give us a brief recap of your experiences with cut and deprogramming? Because I know that you were involved in some pretty high-profile cases.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit about the cases. I probably exited from personal interaction, from talking to people, about 30 or 40 people out of cut, and hundreds of others out of other groups. So I had a wide range of experience with, Summit Lighthouse, Bible-based cults. A couple of them were atheistic. One was an insurance company. One was run by a medical doctor down in Louisiana, based on the Gurdjieff teachings. It just goes on and on, the variations on this theme. But my interest in the Summit Lighthouse came via two groups that I got introduced to when I first moved to Santa Fe. And I read about this group called the Agni Yoga Society and the artist Nicholas Roerich. And I got fascinated with his backstory. He was a mystic, a Russian. He died in 1947. Him and his wife, Helena Roerich, started a group called Agni Yoga in 1920-21. And it was fairly successful. It's one of the more successful of the Theosophy groups that was started by Madame Blavatsky back in the late 19th century. Today, there's about 3 million Agni Yoga members in Russia. So it has a significant following there. Of course, the founders were Russian. Mikhail Gorbachev and his wife were supporters of Agni Yoga, Riza being kind of a devotee back in I found that out when they were going through perestroika in 1989. But in any case, I started studying the I Am teachings because I was hired to help remodel a building that used to be the I Am Center in Santa Fe. And the owner's mother was a devotee of the group, and I got to know her. She was an elderly lady, and she lent me all these books. I was curious about what this sect was about, and it had a lot of what's called New Thought, which is the idea that you put on the perfection of God or Christ in your mind and think only positive thoughts, and good things will happen to you, health, wealth, and prosperity, all of that. And they also combine Theosophy, the idea of channeling ascended masters or masters, angels and gods and whatever, through the particular leaders. So I thought that, I grew up Catholic. As a Catholic, there's all this stuff about saints and communication with saints, and maybe this just ramps it up. So I got curious about it. Friends of mine a couple of years later introduced me to the group they were in, and I met them that first day, but they didn't tell me that they were part of CUT back then. And they got excited because I already was studying a lot of the core teachings that Church Universal taught. And I found out that the Agni Yoga teachings were taught at the 4th level of Summit University, which was their highest level, and I had already read them all. So I figured I was already in, So I started to go out to the conferences in 1979, and I went to 3 of them. The last one I went to was in 1980 in Easter time. The second conference I went to, and Sean, you could probably describe them from your point of view, but there's thousands of devotees were converged at the time near Malibu in California for these 4 or 5 day conferences. I think there were 4 days, and a lot of chanting and listening to lectures. And your mother, of course, was channeling masters, which was an exciting event for everybody there. So I know when I came back from the first one, my first wife told me, she noticed there's something different about me because I really was enthused. And she said, "You're not the same guy I married." I mean, I didn't think I changed, but she saw it, and heard it. And the things that changed were, I cut my hair short to conform with the style, the Mormon-like look that the group members had. Shaved my beard, stopped wearing certain colors like red and black. There were sacred colors in the group. Stopped listening to rock and roll, stopped using marijuana, stopped, listening to jazz.
All the fun stuff.
Yeah,
right.
All the stuff that makes it worth it.
Sex had to be elevated to some kind of a pure level, which irritated my first wife, obviously. So we were divorced. We were divorced within a year of that.
Wow.
And so a lot had to do with my involvement. It wasn't the only thing. So my strict involvement with CUT was for about 3 months. I can remember as being a real devoted person trying to catch up with all the damned lectures that you had to listen to because they were on audio tapes back then, and learning all the decrees. I mean, it was endless amounts of information. No one in the group ever caught up with the information being poured at them from the group that I recall, which is part of the stress. You can never be pure enough in your mind to follow these strict rules. So
interesting.
It sets up a shame game where you're constantly blaming yourself and being shamed by these pure teachings, and that's always in your head. That's what the brainwashing or whatever you want to call it is about.
I used to supervise the production of a lot of those tapes, and let me tell you, the duplicator was running 24 hours a day, 3 shifts on getting out those tapes. We never stopped producing content. It was a factory.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, the content was impossible to catch up with, and there were layers of involvement in the group. They had the staff members, which were the most devoted. I think there were around 700 at the time living on the campus, and most of them lived in rather, we'd consider poverty conditions. They didn't get much money from the group for all the sacrifice they were doing for the group. I think some said they got like $75 a month or $125 a month.
It was really low, room and board plus, barely enough to buy toothpaste and, supplies.
Yeah. So, there were, I guess the people that were real devotees thought of themselves as monks or nuns, which are supposed to be self-serving and self-sacrificing. The Agni Yoga group that, existed in New York City, and it was headed by Sina Fosdick at 107th and Riverside, where the Rorsch Museum is. And I would visit there during all this time. I got to know Sina. She was a direct disciple of the Roriks when she was young. She joined in her 20s. She spoke Russian and she had German. I think her husband may have been German Russian. I'm not sure. But in any case, the Agni Yoga group never pressured me to do anything. It was all my self-involvement. There wasn't any sense of the world's going to end, you have to decree, nothing like that. It was kind of low-key theosophy. And anything I wrote sometimes to Sina, she answered in very short notes, very kind. And she died in the early 1980s. But I did ask them, I said, what do you think of this Church Universal and Triumphant? It's using your teachings and Rorick's paintings. Is it getting copyright stuff? And they said no. And I said, well, aren't you going to sue them or whatever? This is when I was getting out of CUT. And they said no, that the group karma will catch up with them. That's how they put it. So they weren't going to get into litigation. But later I found out that Agni Yoga had its own controversy as well. In 1936, Rorsch, the leader, had gone to an expedition to the Far East and Mongolia with U.S. scientists, and they were sent by FDR. And Rorsch was supposed to be helping to look for seeds and things that could survive the drought during the Dust Bowl in the Southwest. They were going to try to do something about that. And Rorsch wasn't much of a scientist, and he kept running around looking at temples and spiritual sites over there, and the scientists grumbled about him. The U.S. government investigated him and found out that he wasn't paying any taxes on the paintings he was selling over here, which was quite a bit. He was supported by some wealthy millionaires and people around the country at the time. So the U.S. government refused to allow him back in the U.S. after 1936. He was persona non grata. So there's a whole history there of that kind of stuff with Agni Yoga here. The I am activity. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, let's talk about how you finally decided to get out of CUT and start working as an exit counselor. What motivated that for you?
Yeah, I wasn't looking to become a deprogrammer or exit counselor. That was the last thing on my mind. When I noticed the conflicts, one within myself regarding the group, I just said, this is too much. I'm not willing to do all this, which I think most people quit the group because of that. It was high demand. And they said, I'd rather just do something else. But the conflicts I had were internal. The Agni Yoga teachings were saying some things that were very conflicted very much with what CUT was saying. For instance, CUT was anti-communist, virulently so, and anti-liberal. They were very right-wing, waving the flag and all of that sort of thing. And, the old King James Bible was part of their doctrine, whereas the Agni Yoga had nothing to do with Christian Bible. It was more esoteric and mystical, and it invited more Buddhist and Eastern teachings into it. And Roerich, being Russian, he visited Russia and was accepted there, and he viewed Nikolai Lenin as a Mahatma, meaning a great man. And he would have been, again, evil according to the CUT doctrine. So there was one conflict I had. You can't have both in the same group. The I am leaders told me that Elizabeth Prophet was a fake prophet. And I also found that other theosophists like Torquem Saradarian, who ran the Aquarian Educational Group in the Malibu foothills, he regarded your mother, Elizabeth, as a phony. He represented Blavatsky, Bailey, and Agni Yoga. So I kept finding all these conflicts. I said, listen, all these people can't be right, but they can all be wrong. And so I began to back off through a series of steps in the summer of 1980. And, in trying to get out of the CUT mindset, I was actually having panic attacks at night. That's how deep it can get into yourself. And it wasn't until I didn't know what to do about it. I tried all kinds of things, not thinking about it, hiking in the mountains, to kind of purge myself for a day and a half. And it just kept coming back in my head. I stopped to see this Catholic nun, growing up Catholic. It was I knew she was an older lady, and I needed someone to talk to, and I just happened to be going by after a hike where this nunnery was in Santa Fe, and I told her about my problem because it was kind of spiritual, right? And she didn't know what the hell I was talking about, but she's very small, like 4'10", and she said, "Well, Joseph, can I pray with you?" And I said, "Sure." but that personal attention just unleashed some kind of emotion in me, and I started to cry. And after that day, I had this incredible sense of release. It was like psychosomatic, when I look back. And I let go of any sense of guilt or shame I had about the whole thing. It just got flushed out. And when I started reading the critical literature, I had no triggers left. I wasn't afraid of anything. There was no phobias, about dark magicians getting at me for betraying the teachings and all this phobia indoctrination that the group had used on their members. All of that left me, and so I was free to explore. It wasn't about Catholicism. It wasn't about anything. It was about skepticism. I was a true skeptic at the point, and out of anger at myself, I just kept reading and exploring the background of Theosophy, the background of the I Am movement, and all of that. Friends of mine in CUT asked me why I quit, and they wanted to talk to me because they were having some issues. They had been in a lot longer, like 5 or 10 years, a couple of them. So I went to talk to them, and within a few hours, 4 or 5, 6 hours of sitting with them, they quit based on the information I had dug up. So that was my first exit counseling, so to speak. I met a young woman. I did a portrait of her for her fiance at a mall where I worked. And she was trying to recruit me. She worked there also. I was doing portraits for Christmas in 1980. She was trying to recruit me into her Foursquare Gospel Bible Church.
Oh, yeah, that's Amy Semple McPherson, right?
Yeah, it was, but this was run by a guy who considered himself a prophet and all this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of just listened to her and I let her sort of recruit me, but I began to ask her questions and show her differences in her Bible interpretations, because they use the Old King James the same as your mother did.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of flaws in the Old King James translation that are cleared up in later translations. The whole thing in Isaiah that says, "Command ye me," when God says, "Command ye me," that's what they use as the biblical reference to say decreeing is okay. You can decree God's energy.
Right.
And that's a mistranslation. It's not the way. It's not what it's meant. It's not what's meant there. So she had those things wrong, among other things about separation from her family. In any case, in a couple of weeks, she decided to leave her cult. I met her family inadvertently when they came to pick her up. They hadn't seen her in 6 months, and they were Baptists, and she was in a Bible cult, right, that separated her from her family. So they were so happy to meet me. They took me out to dinner, and they prayed and all this stuff. And that's when it dawned on me how much impact, it didn't have just on my personal life, but this kind of thing, what we call manipulative, deceptive cults, or what I call self-sealing social systems, that cut you off from free thinking and exploration with the environment. And it's psychological and spiritual the way they do it. So that imprinted on me how important this whole thing is. I still wanted to avoid getting into it too deeply, but just this one last point. I went to a workshop in Santa Fe that some people, they were actually a mixed group of Christians, were putting on to help people with cults and the occult and all that kind of stuff that was going on at the time. And when I went to their one-day conference, I kept putting my hand up and correcting things they were saying about the New Age and different groups they were mentioning. And they asked me later on if I would help them, because they were going to start this organization called the Center for Christian Information. But a lot of it was non-sectarian, what they were doing, and it was a voluntary thing. So I missed the first meeting, and they called me up and said they elected me chairman. They wondered if I would be chairman of the group. So I decided to help them out. And it was an interesting group of people. It really was. One guy was a professor of philosophy at the College of Santa Fe. And, there was a mixture of people there. One was a minister and one lady was a former nun. So I went to a National Cult Awareness Network conference in Kansas that year to kind of get connected nationally with people that knew more about this stuff in order to help this small group in Santa Fe. And when people at the national conference found out about me, the programmers and exit counselors were asking me if I would help them on certain cases, to go out with interventions, and I could get paid, which I had done all this research for 4 years. I hadn't gotten paid a cent yet, and I was helping people. So I said, okay, and I began to help on these cases, and it just, the calls kept coming in, and by the end of that year, 1986, it was a full-time job.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I started working internationally, and I did it for 12 years. So that's basically how I got into it.
Well, I want to say, I think that, you have an obvious, deep knowledge of the theology. You probably know more about the theology of my parents' group than I do, having grown up there. And the way we got connected was because you have your YouTube channel, and of course we'll link to that in the show notes. And there's so much information there. I love it. And we've touched on some of it already, and we'll touch on more. But what I really want to get into is just the title of our show is, before Q, there was cut. And I'm referring, of course, to the QAnon conspiracy cult and some of the similarities that we see, because it seems so familiar to me, of that conspiracy to cut beliefs, particularly those passed down from some of the predecessor organizations, such as Theosophy and the I Am movement. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a little bit of what your impressions are of QAnon.
Yeah, I did a short piece on it, which was a little bit with some humor, because I wore a tinfoil hat during part of it. That was awesome, man. Like I actually have a note here, because it was really great. In fact, in general, I love when your intros are always really good on your show, and they always have sort of a little bit of an interesting little twist. But like the pulling out the tinfoil hat was just great. It was perfect. It was right on point. You wore it. You wore it good, man. It was great.
Well, the one thing about those short pieces I do is I think about them, but I don't rehearse them. So I think they kind of just happen, and it looks natural, perhaps. I don't know. I don't know what I'm doing, is what I'm trying to tell you. But as long as people get something out of it, so far they have, which is good. QAnon. A writer, a journalist approached me about it a few months ago. They were one of the major newspapers, and they're doing a piece on it back then. And they wanted, and they talked to a colleague of mine that said, you should be talking to Joe, because they were looking for the I am angle to it. Apparently, something about the I am movement or that kind of teaching was influencing the people that put QAnon together when they were doing it from the Philippines, which it was called something like 4can and 8can.
8kun. But first, I think we should explain what the I am movement is. I'm not sure our listeners know that. Right. Now, just to let you know, I haven't really found a direct connection between the two, although there could be some. In other words, the I am didn't create QAnon. That's not what I'm saying here. But the I am movement, I am is the word that comes from the Bible, meaning I am that I am, or God. And so that's where they got their names. And originally it was called the I am activity, and it was founded by Guy and Edna Ballard. And the Ballards founded the movement in the early 1930s. But prior to that, they'd been fascinated with spiritualism and trying to make their living finding gold mines and that kind of thing. And they weren't very successful at it. Guy Ballard got into trouble selling a fake gold mine shares in Chicago to some gold mine called the Lake of Gold out west. And he sold it under a different name, like Brad Gilbert or something. And he was fined and busted in court in Chicago. This is well before he became an I am leader. So what they did was they've been reading all this literature, like Brother of the Fourth Degree. Brother of the Third Degree. Brother of the Third Degree. I've read that.
Third Degree by Garber.
Yeah.
And Maria Corelli's books and all this esoteric books about spirituality. They were influenced by the Psychiatric group up in Moscow, Idaho, which had like a mail order religion where they sent out these things with color-coded prayers, all over the country. It was very successful.
That sounds familiar.
That sounds very familiar to me.
Right. Guy Ballard used that idea to incorporate into his I am movement. He also was influenced by William Dudley Pelley, who was a fascist, an American fascist, that started a group called the Silver Shirts. And you got to remember, this was started around 1930, and he was in court for fascist activities in 1934 in the United States. When he spent a year in jail, but it was so in 1933 when he was indicted, a lot of his members began to go to attend Guy Ballard's I Am activity group.
So let's be really clear. We have Pelley, who was indicted for fascist activity, and his members left his group, the Silver Shirts, and went into the I Am movement.
They went into a big group of them did. In fact, one of the Silver Shirts became the Guy Ballard road manager when they first started going on this lecture tour all over the United States. So the I Am group was based on their first book, which is a kind of a spiritual adventure book by Godfrey Ray King, which was Guy Ballard's pen name, and it was probably written by Edna Ballard because Guy couldn't write very well. But it's a story about Guy Ballard or Godfrey Ray King exploring mines or whatever in Mount Shasta, and he meets this mysterious being that calls himself Saint Germain, and it's that Comte de Saint Germain from the 18th century and 17th. Anyway, Saint Germain was also one of the key figures in Blavatsky's Theosophy in the late 19th century. She channeled information from him. Saint Germain also is a revered figure among a lot of Freemasons that believe in the esoteric part of Freemasonry. So So Guy Ballard as Godfrey meets Saint Germain, and Saint Germain takes him all these spiritual adventures. There's temples inside of Mount Shasta, believe it or not, where things happen, miraculous things, and Guy talks about all his adventures with Saint Germain in this book called Unveiled Mysteries.
Oh, that
and
classic.
Then they put out a second book, very similar to that, called The Magic Presence, and that was the only two spiritual adventures books they put. But that's the foundation Bible, the foundation document for why they exist.
Well, and what's interesting about that is sorry to jump in, but
that's okay.
my mother in her home in Red Bank, New Jersey, where she grew up, found her mother had those I Am books, the Unveiled Mysteries and the Magic Presence, on the shelf. And she found them when she was like 17 years old or whatever. And that started her on the path to looking for this type of organization and wanting to be involved in this type of organization. So it was very influential. And they are somewhat of a fan fiction for Theosophy. Like it was Edna Ballard or whoever wrote those books was kind of just, building onto the previously existing material from Theosophy. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct. In fact, there's dozens and dozens of up to whole paragraphs plagiarized from previous books in order to create Guy Ballard's real adventures with Saint Germain, right? So she was cobbling together material from other sources, so they weren't pure experience in that sense. In any case, the group gathered a lot of members. By a conservative count, 50,000 by the end of the 1930s. The Ballards claimed over 1 million. Of course, they tend to exaggerate everything. And they would lecture at places like Masonic halls, Unity churches, any place that would accept them at the time. And they got quite wealthy. They got a lot of property in Chicago, Santa Fe, and Shasta and other places. And there's I Am centers, or what they call temples today. I visited one about 2 years ago. It's in Philadelphia. There's an I Am temple there. There's a couple of them in Washington, D.C. There's one remaining in Chicago. There's one in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So the cult still has an active membership. Most of them are elderly.
Mm-hmm. And can you just elaborate a little bit more on how you see the fascist and conspiratorial beliefs having traveled from Theosophy to I Am to the Cut movement to later incarnations like QAnon? Yeah, the fascist track comes from the idea that the fasces are this double-headed axe that's bound by rods of power in ancient Italy, and the Caesars would pass the rods of power on to the next Caesar, and Caesar was considered kind of like a divine king. The gods appointed him, and so the idea of fascism means that you have divine right to rule, basically. So it's more than just democratic. It's a lot heavier than that. It comes from above, in other words. So that's where the word comes from. The fascism comes from that. And that's why we are the radical secular, because we are specifically against any sort of divine intervention in human affairs. Like, we think that people should decide democratically how they should be ruled, self-rule. And the idea, as soon as you bring God into it, you're bringing in this unaccountable, invisible being that nobody can argue with. And so it becomes a recipe for tyranny. And that's our whole mission here, is to oppose that.
Yeah, and it's been shown throughout history, like the Holy Roman Empire and whatever, that when you add that kind of transcendent power, which human beings don't have, to a human leader, you're going to run into trouble every time. There's no way around it.
Yeah, right. These people, right, and Godwin's law, right? But I'm going to talk about Adolf Hitler, but this is the most obvious example here, right? Who thought that he was divinely inspired or was a special guy in that specific sense, right? And all through human history, right? I mean, the divine right of kings, right? Mm-hmm. This was always this idea that there is a power above the sort of typically male leader, and he had, and that power, and all the way back to the pharaohs, right? The idea that these individuals are infused or imbued with sort of this this divine power, which gives them the divine right of kings, and they are the top of this hierarchy. And that's something we talk about a lot here on the show, right? We talk about these hierarchies. Certainly, Cut was one of those sorts of hierarchies, but we see this all the time, and it's and within the political sphere, it's terrifying, right? Because you have people. I read, I think this week, right, that there are that the number of people who are of authoritarian mindsets in the United States is somewhere around 20 or 30% of people and typically these are conservatives, right? But these people who are happy to eschew democracy, right? The sort of the idea of having that divine power on top of them and sort of demanding things of them is somehow comforting. So I just think that's a really interesting point that you brought up there.
Yeah. Yeah, we could talk about that for a while too, but just to answer Sean's thing, just, briefly, this track of fascism that comes out of Theosophy, the Nazis, the proto-Nazis, were inspired a lot by the Italian fascists, and early on, Mussolini was interested in Tibetan culture. You know, he knew Alexander David Neal, for instance, who was one of the early explorers, actually went to Tibet and wrote quite a bit about it, sometimes in fanciful ways. But the idea of this ancient wisdom coming from the Far East was embodied in that lore. And of course, the swastika is something that you see around Tibet very much. It's a sacred symbol that symbolizes energy, you know, the great energy, the turning of the wheel, all of that in the cosmos. And it can mean thunder, it can mean lots of things, but it's a power symbol. It also means good fortune, you know, in some cultures. And it's used in parts of Hindu mythology as well. So the Theosophists, borrowing Buddhism, borrowing out of Hinduism, adopted the swastika, and you begin seeing it in certain esoteric publications. Began appearing in the early 1900s in Germany. And the people that became fascists borrowed a lot from what was called Ariosophy. And Ariosophy was a form of theosophy that believed in the Aryan, it comes from Aryan, A-R-I-A. The Aryan people were supposed to be the superior people that dominated India. You know, they came from the Middle East, and they brought the sky god with them, you know. So the fascist idea came through Ariosophy. Also, the swastika was adopted then among these people. And I guess the people that supported Hitler felt that this was a symbol of their ancient culture, came from the Aryan race, which was Tibet, which was, you know, that part of India. So that's why the flag was adopted. It's their spiritual source is what they believed. And now in the United States, we had a large fascist movement here also. They were anti-liberal back then. And I mentioned the silver shirts, but they weren't the only one. So there was a lot of tension back then in the 20s between the liberal, the Marxist. You know, there was a lot of people in the United States that were leaning that way, that wanted to bring power to the people, so to speak. You know, the idea that the proletariat could rise and rule and everything would be shared equally. It was almost a Christian idea, you know, in a sense. And then without God. And then you had the fascist idea that you needed some kind of a power and divine right and ultra-nationalism, the spirit of the people, you know, the Uncle Sam idea, the idea that the fatherland or the motherland was more sacred than anything, and you should be willing to die for her or for him. You know, that kind of thing was
blood and soil.
Those two forces were very common back then in the United States, and we still see them today, you know, acting up.
Yeah, the blood and soil, and also, you know, we see a lot the whole racial thing. Wasn't that a big deal in the IM activity, the racial issue?
Yeah, when I first approached the IM group, this old woman that I talked to, she told me everything I asked. She was very open about it, and I asked about the race thing, and she said that basically that Black people have a peculiar karma that doesn't bring them into the vibration level you need to become an I-ammer today. And, which is fascinating, because later on when I was doing exit counseling, the Black family hired me to get their Black aunt, who was in her 60s, out of the I-am group in Washington, D.C. But she was part of a temple. There was a segregated temple. There was a Black I-am temple and a white one. And this is back in the late 80s. So we're talking well past segregation and all of that, right?
That is astonishing. It's even more astonishing that she's okay with that.
She was okay with it. Somehow they bought the idea that this is the way God decreed it, and therefore that's the way it is, right? Of course, there was also this thing in Theosophy which didn't believe in evolution and thought that the white race or whatever, the elite race, the Gnostics among us, came from some other spiritual source, and that the Black race was some kind of an aberration of apes and humans mating. That was a common theme from the 19th century. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and then there was there was the root races, right? I remember hearing a lot. My parents talk about
Blavatsky's idea of root race. Yeah.
Yeah. And there were 7 root races. Like, how did they explain it? And I think Mormons have something like this too, don't they?
They did too. Now they've adjusted their so-called inspiration from on high over the years, and Blacks are allowed to become higher Mormons now.
I'll bet they have. Yeah.
Well, not totally, right. but in print, they've done that.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. I mean,
let me get this sort of straight here, because what Blavatsky did with Darwin was the same thing that Marx did with Hegel. Okay, Hegel developed this evolving dialectic through Fichte that eventually you'd come to a God-organized world, through this system he put up, that Kierkegaard called comic, if you took it seriously. So Marx took Hegel's idea, which was dominant during that period, and flipped it on its head and showed there's no God involved in this, but there is an evolving dialectic, and you have capitalism, which is good to a point. It gets saturated. It has to collapse, and then the proletariat comes up, and you come up with this utopian state. It's the way history moves, like almost Darwinian, in a sense. So, like a social Darwinism kind of an approach to it. Blavatsky had a stuffed baboon in her apartment in New York City when she started, and it was dressed up like Darwin. It had spectacles on, and it was holding a copy of The Origin of Species, this baboon she had. Yeah, so she specifically took Darwin's secular approach to evolution and reinfused it with spirituality, claiming that there were all these root races. The original race of humanoid type creatures was very ethereal, almost angelic, and they became more materialistic through different thousands and thousands of years of evolution until we got down to the material human being that we are now. And now we're moving back towards spirituality, and Theosophy was the key, moving us toward this time and space where we're no longer going to be creatures, we're going to become angelic. So the I Am movement taking off on this, for instance, they said that when they took over the United States, when the I Amers took over the United States, the flag would no longer be red, white, and blue. It would be gold, white, and blue, because red is an evil color.
That's where that came from. That's where that gold flag came from. I never knew where that came from.
Yeah,
wow,
because red is an evil color. It's the color of anger. It's the color of sex, or whatever.
Yeah, we have a red flag here. So
and as far as blood, if you cut yourself and you're in that future I Am 1,000-year Reich or whatever they thought that we were going to have as advanced beings, blood would be turned to gold. We would no longer have red blood. That's how far and crazy and literal their teachings were getting. Yeah.
Well, it's funny because I think that, my parents they probably got rid of some of that craziness. But if you look at some of the Keepers of the Flame lessons and what are in the Keepers of the Flame lessons, they contain some of that just really out there stuff. That was, and that's why they kept those secret, because if you had to be to become a Keeper of the Flame was a higher level of membership. They didn't release that information to the normal, average people who came in.
Yeah, I went through all the Keepers of the Flame lessons. I mean, I began, I applied for them to begin because that was the first step to become a member. and I went to up to 33. I think is they had kind of mimicking the Masonic 33 levels of initiation is what they did with that. And they were so bizarre and abstruse. I mean, even as a believer, I couldn't make sense of a lot of the stuff that Mark Prophet wrote, because he was kind of fishing for his hyper reality and coming up with stuff that he was channeling, right? And channeled information can be really bizarre and vague if you don't edit it. You know? So, but there was one of the keeper lessons talked about alchemy and how you could, turn things into gold. But it intimated that you could really do this kind of thing, that you could actually use the power of the spoken word and pick up something, like this object and turn it into gold by talking to it, so.
Yeah. When you get,
they implied that in the teachings.
When you get into these areas where you can do good magic and transformation, spiritual transformation, you also have on the other side of it, the dark, which is where you get into this, the stuff that's like QAnon, whether you're talking about the aliens or the blood drinking, Satanists or whatever. And of course, my Baphomet shirt here is gonna piss everybody off, but about that, because they really see these things as being real, real parts of what's really actually a battle that I think takes place in human psychology between good and evil. They've externalized that to gods and devils, but these are kind of more or less like, fictional creatures that that are just invented. And so you bring it back to something like QAnon, and they come up with these blood drinking cannibalistic pedophiles, right? And that's what this represents to a lot of Christians.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's really, I'm also wearing a shirt that is it's a play on the Misfits. And we talked about it earlier, and the Misfits is a band, and there's a skull. And it's all about sort of like the sort of Halloween-ish type theme, and it's sort of like ghoulish, and it's precisely the kind of stuff that they talk about in Cut. They talk about in these organizations as being like sort of the permutations of this evil, right? This is like hard rock and roll with skulls and all this sort of thing, right? I wanted to also point out that, right, just to circle back a little bit from what you were saying earlier, just so our listeners know who may not know about this thing. So when your Keepers of the Flame was sort of one of the many terms, there was Chilas, there was a lot of different terms that were to describe the sort of adherence to the Cut movement. And so there were a lot of different names again, but I just want to sort of point that out so it's not just sitting out there. People are like, what the hell is a Keeper of the Flame? But so just so everybody knows.
I should have brought that up. But I mean, almost like when you have QAnon, I mean, QAnon is almost a channeling because they keep dropping these messages, right? They're almost like channeled messages. And I just wondered if you think, what is the whole attraction, Joe, to channeling in the first place?
Well, I've explored it quite a bit. And in fact, I've done a lot of research in the sense of sitting in channeler sessions that were quite well known. And I would pay to go to their meetings, and the person would be channeling some kind of a being. And the ones I chose to go to were ones that allowed the audience to interact with the channeled being. In other words, it would be like your mother channeling Saint Germain and people in the audience asking Saint Germain questions. Now that's risky for the channel, and that's why most channels won't allow it. So what I think it is basically, I call them mind puppets. The ascended masters or these creatures that psychics channel, like Uncle Harry in the heavens or whatever. It's a mind puppet. It's something that we create in ourselves, but we give the illusion to the audience that the thing that possesses us has its own agency. That's the illusion you want. Just like with a puppet show, you want the kids to believe that the puppet has its own agency. It's its own agent. It's talking. It has its own mind, its own personality. And you can even back up, and like I mentioned in one of my videos, that the whole movie industry relies on the audience suspending judgment and suspending reality enough to allow that character on screen or on stage to have a separate agency from the human being that plays it. So that you're no longer seeing, Arnold Schwarzenegger. You're seeing the Terminator, and you're feeling it, and you're identifying with the power of the Terminator. And even though your mind kind of flips back and forth a little bit, But basically, to enjoy the movie, you have to have the capacity to shut off what we call creature reality, your reality testing, and absorb yourself in the magic of the theater. And it makes it more enjoyable. So it's kind of a talent that we have. It's like a tool. It's actually a tool. We have a scissor here that's a tool. We can use it for all kinds of things. I can use it as a weapon, and I can use it as a creative object, right? So as an actor, you're using it as a creative object, this ability to do a mind puppet that animates your body. And if you do it really well, it's very convincing. People are happy that they, enjoyed it and have almost therapeutic reactions because they cry, they smile, they feel rage, they feel happy when the hero wins and all of that stuff, which is what Greek theater was all about. That's what it was meant to be, to have catharsis, right? So channeling is a form of acting, but it takes, the tool and wants you to believe that they're not the agent, that the thing has agency in itself. And that's where the lie comes in. That's where the manipulation comes in.
It's fascinating.
It's interesting. It's totally interesting to me that you have, film and theater and all those things, and they're completely harmless. I mean, they're, it's
not completely. People get crazy watching film sometimes.
Okay.
You can change people's minds.
But here's the key, I think. Yeah. I mean, you have something that crosses the line from entertainment to when somebody believes that it's real. And that when you cross that line, that's when all hell breaks loose, because you've got this person, whoever's doing these Q drops, there's been 5,000 Q drops or whatever. And they're effectively, it's a channel to an unknown source, who has its own agency, who is, somehow has secret knowledge. And the idea of secret knowledge that nobody else has, and that about things that are real. This is not a game. I mean, for a lot of people, it's a game, but
right.
But a lot of people take it very seriously. And what I wanted to ask you about it is, do you think that QAnon is a religion? Do you think it's an elaborate prank? Do you think it's a cult? I mean, how would you define this phenomenon? Because it's taken off. There are millions of people involved in it.
Yeah, up to 5 million, and it's everything you mentioned. It's full of permutations that shift with the Q drops of the day and the conspiracy du jour. I think it started out as a kind of a game with some serious intent behind it. But, kind of like Jumanji, you play this game and you end up in a real world and you're lost in the rabbit hole and you're fighting for your life, right? And then you can emerge from it. I use the book Foucault's Pendulum by Eco as an example, where the novel talks about these authors that come up with this computer game, this conspiracy thing, and they start spreading it around as if it's real, and they get caught up in it themselves. So in other words, the game becomes real. It flips during the novel. And when you're reading it, you really don't know what's real and what's not real. Eco was a brilliant writer. He was a semiotician, and he understood his territory. In fact, Saint Germain is a character that's one of the main characters in Foucault's Pendulum. So it's kind of fascinating from my personal view to read it. But, I work in a psych hospital, and I have for 20 years. And so I meet people at their worst when police bring them in, or when they come in, and they're very depressed, they're suicidal, or they're psychotic. And I wrote about this, but I'll give you one example. And this happens often, where someone who's having their first psychotic break, they're young, and this schizophrenia starts to come in. And this one young man was coming in, and he was very upset. The police brought him in. And he claimed that he was hearing voices, but these were real spirits coming to him from the past, trying to warn us that something dire is happening to mankind, and he has to tell people about this. But there were some of the spirits were kind of evil that was against the ones that weren't evil. And one of the spirits was like a machine, more like a cyborg that was talking to him. So he had a very elaborate, conglomerate, almost like the ascended masters were beginning to appear. And he went to a church to try to figure out what was going on, and they didn't help him, a Catholic church. And he began looking on the internet, and people began to turn him off, telling him to go dead. In other words, stop looking at this stuff and you'll be better, because he was seeing himself in Wicca. He was seeing himself in all this kind of stuff. So anyway, our doctor saw him briefly and he said, we got to give him a shot because he was so anxious and whatever. And we were going to give him Thorazine to help him calm down. It was just a common old drug that works very well for that kind of condition. So he was arguing with me that he didn't want the medication. He wanted to prove to me that his voices were real. I said, okay, let's see. I said, do you think it could read my mind? I said, I'm thinking of a word right now, an animal. I'll give you a hint. And so ask, because he was channeling God. He thought God was in his head too. And he guessed things like aardvark and whatever. I said, no. I said, it's a 3-letter word. I was giving him all kinds of hints. And I said, okay, your God's not working. It's cat. The word is cat. That's all I'm thinking. And I was thinking it really loud. He should have heard it, So then he wanted one more test. And this time I wrote a word on a piece of paper and I folded it and I gave it to the nurse. And I said, the nurse is going to hold it. She has your medication. I said, if you can tell me what's on that piece of paper, we won't give you the medication, So he's guessing all kinds of things and nothing's working. God's not helping him. And so we gave him the shot. And then he asked me, what was the word? And I opened a paper. It was Thorazine, so which is what he got. So, but all I'm pointing out here is that when you're dealing with channeling, and somebody believes that the agent is autonomous, it's an autonomous complex, that's the same as what we call schizophrenia. Schiz means to split the mind from one section from the other. So what's happening with mental patients is one of the things we do is that I do is check what's called reality testing. And you want to see if that's working well in the person. You're trained to do that by looking at what their behavior is. So reality testing is a very important part of sanity, of what we mean when we're sane, when we're in sync with the environment, the social environment, the intellectual environment, the physical environment, and all of that. And so if we're not reality testing well, we can end up in psychosis or deep depression or mania, because then it goes out the window. And that's basically what you're talking about, I think, as secularists, is you're trying to reality test the social environment. How well is it working? So, but backing up to the channeler, some people that are channeling are quite functional. They do well in society, even though they believe they're channeling Lazarus or some other creature, from a UFO or whatever, but they still can set that aside and function pretty well. So they're not dysfunctional. They're not the type of person that's going to get hospitalized. And that's what most channeling groups operate under. The leader is a functional human being. They're not insane. They are, however, participating in a form of schizophrenia.
Wow.
So that's the best way I can explain it.
Wow, that is fascinating.
It's fascinating. And the one thing I can say is that, when growing up in this environment, I kind of thought like my mom and dad were the only ones doing this. And after I got out, I started realizing there's channels everywhere. They're all over the place. And, a friend of mine who actually helps us with this show a bit, I mean, his mother was channeling an entity named Dr. Duran. And, this is like, and the Dr. Duran was like El Moria, very, very similar personality. It's like when I started understanding that these archetypes of beings that are being channeled are fairly common across the world. And, Ramtha, and listening and some of these channelers are better than others. They're really, some of them are real performance artists. I think my mom wasn't bad, Oh,
your mom, I think, was very talented. I mean, she really knew what she was doing. And I always remember, even as a young person, going and speaking to her and being brought up. And of course, my dad would be basically like on his knees. Right. And, I'd be standing there, and her presence was such that you really felt like you were in the presence of somebody who was divine, or somebody who was a cut above, not your just normal human being, right? And of course, a combination of that is the way she was revered, but also I think it's just, and sort of me being a child also, right? But I think also that she really was talented. Like, she was a really charismatic, talented woman.
Yeah. Now, you got to remember what charisma is here. And I agree, she had charisma, but within a context. outside the context, she would seem bizarre, weird, even awkward. So charisma is about relationship. When you look at the meaning of the word, it only works in relationship. And so the person has to project the charisma on the hero object. There has to be a hero object. And if you don't believe the person's a hero, they might just come off as an asshole. They don't feel charismatic at all. For instance, today you have people that believe that Donald Trump is charismatic, right? But if you don't buy his act, you can use all kinds of other words to describe him. You don't feel the charisma.
Definitely not charismatic.
Charisma depends on context, on relationship. So it's not something that's innate, is what I'm trying to point out.
Oh, that's a really interesting insight. Thanks for that.
Yeah.
Well, any final thoughts? Because I think we've actually hit our time limit.
Wow,
this has been an incredibly interesting conversation, and I don't know, Christophe, do you have any final thoughts, or Joe?
Well, I have a question, Joe. So are you at this point in your life, do you practice any kind of, I assume that you're not involved in any cult, but I also assume that you're not involved in any religion, but is there any kind of sort of spirituality or some sort of idea from that camp that you follow or practice or think about?
Yeah, at my age, I'm 73 now, so I've explored a lot of this stuff, and I was forced to. Being a intervention specialist, I would constantly be challenged by some new group and new idea. So I had to have a good handle on comparative religions, what they really taught and the permutations and how they valued themselves and the conflicts within the group and all of that. And I also have a deep interest in philosophy, and so I've looked at a lot of that, and I've come to find that I'm basically a pragmatist. I see atheism as a kind of a symbolic way of looking at the world, and we need symbolic ways of looking at the world, but we want to keep them healthy. That's the thing. Human beings, according to Otto Rank, are forced into this idea of creating a symbolic world in order to deal with the terror of death. If we didn't have it, we would collapse psychologically. So we all come up with this stuff. If we don't, we become really neurotic, believe me. So whether it's atheism or theism or some weird mix of like Spinozian panentheism, whatever it is that floats your boat, that's good. That's not a bad idea. So I've come to pragmatism, and what pragmatism, according to Charles Sanders Peirce and God, he was a psychologist. My mind's not working here, but people like anyway, I'll remember later. But Peirce was the one that coined this term in the 19th century, and he basically said that it's not really an ism like other things are. It's a way of looking at anything, a pragmatic way to make it kind of work. So you could be a pragmatist as a Catholic, a pragmatist as an atheist, a pragmatist as a Buddhist. So what it does is you apply as much skepticism as your system can bear in order to keep it healthy. That's the best way I can describe a pragmatist. I don't discount the value of certain kinds of Catholicism or certain kinds of Buddhism or certain kinds of Islam. There are what I call elegant expressions of these religions with good people in them. And those people can tolerate dissent. That's the whole point that I have to look for. If a pragmatist is someone that can tolerate dissent as long as it isn't extreme to the point, where I'll kill you if you disagree with me. You should be able to tolerate it and argue with it or discuss with it. So basically, yeah, I follow that idea of Peirce, and so many others have done that after him. It's kind of low-key belief system, if you want to put it that way.
Awesome.
Well, we like that. We like, because secularism is really that. It says nobody gets to be in charge. No religion gets to, make the rules for everybody else who doesn't believe that religion. So, all religions should be taught as, comparative religion, like you said, in school, so that people understand what other people believe, rather than just being taught one religion, the state religion, which essentially here is Christianity. don't like that. We think that that leads to, Christian nationalism and all kinds of other problems, and conflict with Islam and conflict with, everything else. So that's why we're radically secular.
But when you look at the founding fathers, they pushed toward a kind of secularism too.
Mm-hmm.
And if you look into the Federalist Papers, one of the things they argued that was most damaging to any kind of a nation was called factionalism. And you could throw cults, gangs, mafia, whatever you want. But to have a faction running the nation was dangerous.
Yep.
So they set up the system and so that factions couldn't rule here. You could rule them, you could get them out of office in a few years if you had to. Yeah. And they allowed freedom of expression and freedom of religion so that the factions could argue with one another here freely without one being able to make rules and laws about the other. Yeah. So it's kind of messy. And it doesn't satisfy everybody. It certainly doesn't satisfy the factionalists. If you're a hardcore fundamentalist, you're not going to like that. But hell, you live in America. If you're an American, you got to put up with this. The founding fathers were pragmatists in this regard.
Yeah. Well, Joe Szimhart, thank you so much for being with us. We're really happy that you took the time and really enjoyed all of your insights. So hopefully we can talk to you again sometime.
Yeah, appreciate it. Nice to be here. Thank you again.
Absolutely. All right, that was a great segment with Joe Szimhart, and now it's time to do Off the Radical Radar. So what were you up to this week, Christophe?
Yeah, well, as I talked about, I did some voting, which was pretty awesome, and it was really just sort of great to cast that ballot. I remember casting the ballot back in 2016 and just feeling really great about it, but I think I feel even more great about it, dumping that sort of envelope in. And that was amazing. I also did earlier, I did some maintenance. So I had to clear a gutter. We have an old house, over 100 years old. There's always something going wrong with it. And frankly, we do pretty well overall, but maintenance is important. And so I maintain the grass and maintain the house. And I bring this up because it's so in our society, everyone talks about job creators and innovators and how important all these people are and how sexy it is. But, the people that keep our world going are people that do maintenance, right? So people that maintain our sewer system, maintain our electric system, who take away the garbage, who do all the things that make, and also who maintain the products that the innovators create. So I just want to point out how important that is and this is why I always harp on maintenance. If anybody watches my Instagram story, you'll know that I'm always saying maintenance. And the last thing is I just want to do a shout out to Joe Acapinti, who he wrote our piece for the last Just Words fallacy. And also, Joe is just an awesome guy. And I think that it's important to be like, look, to recognize the people that are supporting our show during these early stages. We're only 16 episodes in, and we have these people who are like weekly watchers and listeners, and we love them.
This is our brain trust. All these people and are contributing to this, we are grateful. Absolutely. And, so yes, for me, same thing. We voted, and I think it was great because what we did is during the judicial primary, nobody bothers with judges. And
so true.
During the judicial primary, we actually watched all the judicial debates, and so we chose because I'm an anti-hierarchy voter. I will vote for, Democratic appointee over Republican, secular law school over, BYU or Notre Dame. I'll vote for a woman over a man. I'll vote for a person of color over a white person. I'm just down the line. If there's a choice, if there's an equally qualified candidate, I'm gonna go that way. So that's what we did, and most of our judge candidates won, actually, the ones that we voted for in the primary. And the ones that didn't, there was a voter guide, and I was able to basically use those criteria to select, but that was good because there's like 30 of them. I mean, and these are people who are making law. They're making law, and they're ruling on cases that are important. And, the justice system is, so we did that. And then of course, obviously voted straight ticket blue for everything else. And, so it felt good. It felt really good. And, the other thing we did this week is, and you were involved in this too, Christophe, was we're discussing changing up our music theme for the show because we just picked a piece of library music, and now it's getting a little bit tired, and we want to do our own thing. So we're gonna be working on that. And that's about it.
Yeah, and just like that, we've checked below the radar.
Okay, well, our third segment today, and obviously we've covered a lot of ground, but we just want to briefly, kind of go over some of the hopeful things and, what we would do cleaning up the mess of this administration, what we would do, if Biden does win. And, I just wonder, Christophe, what you think about this, if we're ever going to be able to look forward to a time in our history when we're not going to be dealing with this, fake news conspiracy bullshit and QAnon. I mean, it's just like, are we doomed?
I think that's a really interesting question. And it really, I think, harks back to what we talked about last week, I think, in some ways, right? We talked about the social dilemma, and it dovetails also with what I heard one of Obama's, when I listened to him talk for about an hour. One of his biggest concerns, right, is after Trump is gone, how do we rein in the problem of fake news, and the internet's sort of conspiracy, the impact that the internet has on the explosion of conspiracy theories and people being able to create their own reality, right? How do we establish some level of objective truth? I mean, I think this is why secularism and the radical secular and what we're doing here is so important, right? Because it establishes a baseline from which, right, a part of it is sort of rationality. We talk about that, right, as a baseline, from a starting point from which we can have conversations, and we can have debates about various things, and we should have debates. But
oh yeah,
you know what I'm saying? We're
going to keep hammering, and the main thing we're concerned about, like, honestly, most things that involve expert opinion, I don't really have an opinion. I'm going to listen to the experts. And that's, I think, number one. We got to get people to start listening to experts again and respecting expertise, because, I don't know, you don't know. And we want to have the people who've spent their lives working on a problem be the ones that we put in charge of the problem. And so, but we can't do it without the political system. I mean, do you think that there's going to be court packing? How are we going to deal with this?
Yeah, this is huge, man. And I listened to a really great segment this week. I don't remember what I listened to it on, but it was one of these very, very sort of lefty organizations, nonprofit organizations, and it's all about getting progressives, people like you and me, like, into the fight in terms of judiciary, because the judiciary isn't as sexy as the other branches, and so people start like, eyes glaze over, and it ends up not sounding that important. Now, the death of RBG obviously sort of infused the race with people that now start with energy around this issue. But he brought this up and he was like, look, we as Democrats and as progressives, we need to start fighting fire with fire. I love hearing this because we talk about this all the time. We're in a knife fight in a fucking phone booth. This is not, let's go back to the Gentile Feinstein approach, right? Which is like, oh no, they're just like us. She's out. She needs to go, because and he's talking about, we need progressives that are taking this seriously, that care about this stuff. And so, and he brought up a concept which is really important. The way this works is mutually assured destruction. And so just like a nuclear arms race, and that means that the Republicans might come to heel and start acting like adults if they've realized that we as progressives are actually going to fight fire with fire. Once we right, so it's like the argument that it's going to be now like a sort of arms race for court packing arms race from now forward, I don't know that holds any water, because again, if the Republicans realize that we are willing to fight on their terms, we are willing to get we're willing to get into the knife fight. We are not going to demur. I think then we have a chance.
That's the most important thing. And, I think it affects everything. Like, for example, Roe v. Wade. I mean, there's all sorts of questions that come up. I was looking at a map last night about where abortion would be illegal, places that have trigger laws. As soon as the Supreme Court overturns Roe v. Wade, immediately abortion becomes illegal in those states. There's like 10 states. And so what happens then? Okay, the idea is that people are going to maybe travel from those states to other states. But you see, there's nothing stopping those states then from criminalizing. Like, if their citizen goes to another state, gets an abortion, they could have sanctions when they get home. There's all kinds of things.
Point.
They could also start to do things like jerk the medical license of any doctor who's ever performed abortions in another state, things like that. So the good news, I think, about Roe v. Wade being overturned is that we take that wedge issue back from Republicans. They've had this wedge issue for 50 fucking years, okay? And so now Democrats are going to be energized to turn out to overturn these state laws, to elect state politicians who will restore the right to abortion in their state. Okay, that's a big bright spot to me. That
is so true. That's so true. You know what? I'm sorry to cut you off. I'm sorry. I shouldn't.
No, please.
I was just thinking, right? Like the analogy here really works, and that is that Trump brought racism and the problems with our government and the problems with money and money in government, like right to the fore, right? And same thing with McConnell for the last fucking 14 years or whatever. He's been showing exactly what the problem is when there is unaccountability in government. He is exactly the problem, right? And so and the Roe v. Wade issue is going to make this very salient, and particularly for women, young women, for obvious reasons, but for everyone who cares about women's right to choose, all of a sudden it's going to be stopping an academic thing up there in the ether, and all of a sudden it's going to be very, very real. If you live in Texas, you cannot get an abortion. If you live in Ohio, you cannot get an abortion, just like that, right? And so I think it'll help pull progressives off of the bench in the same way that Trumpism has pulled progressives off the bench.
Yeah. Well, and in terms of that, we've had this situation in our politics forever where this money has been affecting things, right? And also theocracy. And I've been railing about theocracy for 20 years. And all of a sudden, I think in a way this could be a blessing in disguise, because all of a sudden people who didn't listen, and it's like, I hate being right about this. I really don't like to be right. But, we started warning about this when George W. Bush got elected, that that we were going to be moving towards this theocracy. And now it's real. Amy Coney Barrett is going to bring in theocracy to the United States, and people are going to have to get off their asses if they want to turn it around. And that is going to, young people have no idea what it's like to live in a world where, abortion, gay marriage, and all these things are illegal. They haven't experienced it. I mean, some have. I mean, gay marriage has only been legal for 5 years, but, the acceptance, the universal sort of acceptance of these things has been, and if you're 20, 30 years old, your whole life, there's been, it's been accepted. So we have to let people know, and the Republicans are going to do this. They're going to let people know what the stakes are, and that's, I think, the most hopeful thing.
I think that's right. Yeah.
I mean, and so restoring voting rights, because this is the other area that they're going to get into. They want to lock in this theocracy, and then they want to prevent our ability to vote it out. So restoring voting rights after, Biden is elected is going to be job one, and doing it in a way that passes Supreme Court scrutiny. Because remember, the Voting Rights Act was all about overruling states. And so if we can get this done at the state level, then it makes an end run around that problem.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I mean, if we are unable to pack the court or there are all kinds of proposals out there, from the most reasonable to the most obscure. This is not something Biden's going to do unless unless the court starts doing really, really crazy things. Then you're going to see Biden do this. But Biden's an institutionalist. He's not going to do that unless it gets to that point. But these sort of things are, like, the great news is, Nancy Pelosi has already passed. These bills are already passed in the House, right? Like, they already exist. If we get the Senate, like, on day one, these bills will be on the Senate floor, right? On day one, voting rights, national election as a national holiday, all the sort of things that we can put in place to really counter some of this stuff, and basically hem the Supreme Court in from a legal perspective.
And even pass, even enshrine, a woman's right to abortion in the law.
Exactly.
So it's no longer just dependent on being a privacy right or whatever other rationalizations Roe v. Wade is based on.
Exactly. This is exactly right. So you go ahead, strike down Roe v. Wade, but guess what? We have the other two branches of government. This is a three-pronged strategy. You might have an obstinate right-wing sort of judicial machine nationwide, but they don't make laws, right? They don't make laws. And so there are ways and strategies that Democrats can take to sort of hem the Supreme Court in. And look, I mean, they are ensuring, just like in California, I always say to Lindsay, California, if you want to see what the future looks like, go to California, because California is always doing what everyone else will be doing in 10 years or 20 years. And so look at California, right? California tried this too. They went on an anti-immigrant tirade for X number of years, and they did well for a while, but eventually they lost on that.
Thrown out.
They got thrown out, and now the Democrats just do what they want in California.
Yeah. The Republican nightmare, single party Democratic rule.
Exactly.
Well, hopefully we'll have that. Everything depends on the Senate, folks. Everything depends on it. So fingers crossed.
The whole shebang, man. And, as we finish out this thing, I just cannot keep. I remember when Trump was first elected and remember how dark those days were. And the silver lining was always what we're talking about right now, which is that this will reveal what people like you and I have been talking about for years and years and years. The things that people wanted to pretend weren't real, wanted to say like, oh no, both sides and all that. No, it is not both sides. There are bad people everywhere for sure, right? I mean, Harvey Weinstein was a Democrat, right? Trump was a Democrat for most of his life, right? I'm not saying there's not bad people in the Democratic Party, but we're talking about trends and directions and what these parties stand for. And it's being revealed precisely what the Republican Party stands for and what they've been riding this tiger, as Obama likes to say. They've been riding this tiger at least since the 60s, right? They've been riding this tiger of racism and right grievance and racial animus, and because it got them votes and because they didn't want to have to change. And so now this is it. They've ridden the tiger as long as they can ride it, I think. I really do. And even if Trump gets another 3 years, it will only be even worse after that, like even more obvious to everybody that this party is completely bankrupt.
They're done. Yeah. All right. Well, once again, I want to remind you to make sure and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. And if you're watching this on YouTube, be sure to hit that red subscribe button and be sure to give us a 5-star rating at your podcast host. Tell your friends and family about our show. Word of mouth really matters. And check out the Just Words Fallacy Medium publication. The link is in the bio. And look, thank you everybody for being here. And remember, wherever you are, you can be radically secular.